Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, John Rubino. John authored and co-authored multiple books. The latest are The Collapse of the Dollar, How to Profit from It, The Money Bubble. John is the creator and owner of the website dollarcollapse.com, and I am very happy to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. John, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Hey, Dave. Good to be back.
Hey, thanks for being back. I guess this is on everyone's mind, how the economy is doing. We know that Trump, when he came into office, he promised all these jobs, all the manufacturing jobs coming back, made a lot of promises, and we still see the economy chugging along. From the past, we see all the stats, all the manipulation, and at this point, we would have thought that the economy would have come down already, but it's still moving forward. I mean, if we go back to 2008, when they had the movie The Big Short, and they talked about the subprime security and those individuals that were looking inside the subprime security funds, and they saw that they were completely garbage. They thought it was going to come down too, but the manipulation went on much longer. When you look at all of this, at this point, do you think that the economy should have come down already? And why do you think it's still moving forward? Why do you think it hasn't come down?
Well, this recovery, first of all, has been a lot slower than usual. And the reason for that is that we took on so much debt in the previous 30 years that the 2008-2009 crisis was much bigger than usual. So we had a deeper hole to climb out of. And it took insane amounts of debt and incredible currency creation on the part of all the developed world countries in order to really keep us from falling into a 1930s style deflationary depression. And so this went on for year after year after year of, slow growth and, substandard numbers and people thinking that we were still in recession and everything. And at the beginning of 2016, it looked like we were heading back into recession, where most of the trends in the US and Europe and Japan and China were negative. And that spooked the world's governments and led them to step on the gas to actually increase the amount of debt that they were taking on and money they were spending and currency that they were creating, et cetera, et cetera. So that in 2016, for instance, the US federal government borrowed another $1 trillion on top of the 7 or 8 trillion that they had borrowed in the previous 5 or 6 years. The Japanese central bank, of course, monetized everything in sight, including the Japanese equity market. China took on a huge amount of new debt. Their banking system made about $1.8 trillion of new loans in 2016. And the European Central Bank massively expanded its balance sheet by buying back basically every bond in sight, and so flooding the banking system with newly created euros. All of that had an effect, finally. And we have today an economy that's growing at what you would expect it to be growing after 5 or 6 years of a recovery. So we're back in kind of familiar territory now where prices are starting to tick up, which is how most people define inflation. And the labor markets are kind of sort of tightening in most of the developed world. And this is leading at least the US central bank to want to raise interest rates. Now, we've seen this story before, of course, maybe a dozen times in the last 100 years, where things start to tighten up, inflation starts to accelerate, the central bank starts to raise interest rates, and the bond markets react by raising interest rates at the long end. And eventually that pushes the system back into recession. So there's nothing unfamiliar or mystical magical really about what's happening right now. We're in familiar territory, but we're leveraged to an extent that we've never been leveraged before. We've never owed this much money. And we've never had this much hidden financial leverage out there in the form of unfunded liabilities and derivatives and other things that together dwarf the officially noted debt that's out there. So when the next recession comes, and it will come as the financial markets react to rising inflation with higher interest rates, it's not clear how we handle it. And the governments of the world understand this, and they're terrified. They have no idea what they're going to do when the next 2008-2009 crisis hits, which it will. And they've got twice as much debt as they had back then when the amount of bad debt in the system almost blew up the global economy. So that's what we're looking at out there. And the question is, does it happen later this year? Does it happen in 2018? And that's something that's unpredictable, of course, because a lot of it depends on the decisions made by people sitting around a conference table at the Fed or the ECB or the Bank of China under a lot of pressure and with bad models that don't give them clear information. They're going to do what they do, and it's almost certainly going to be wrong because there really is no right answer with this kind of leverage. You can't get from owing 300 or 400% of GDP to sustainable growth with minimal inflation and high employment without a huge amount of pain somewhere to wipe out that debt. So either we inflate it away, which is what we're trying to do, or we collapse under the weight of it and have a 1930s style depression, which would happen if we weren't trying to inflate away the debt. But that's basically it. Those are our two choices. And when it hits, it'll be incredibly surprising to both the people in charge and to most people who have been lulled into sense of security by the idea that the guys in charge are smart and know what they're doing, when in fact they may be smart in an IQ sense, but they flat out don't understand the system that they're trying to run. Jim Rickards has a good analogy, which is that the people in charge of the global monetary system think they're working with a thermostat, where you can turn it up a little, turn it down a little, and you keep doing that to keep the system in equilibrium. But what they're really working with is a nuclear reactor, which goes critical if it gets too far out of whack. And the leverage that we're taking on is pushing today's system so far out of whack that going critical is basically a guarantee at some point in the not too distant future. So the world is about to change, Dave, in really disturbing and for most people really surprising ways. And it's only a question of timing at this point.
I mean, we see many things happening all at once. I mean, it's happening out in Europe where the UK is leaving the EU. It looks like they're going to invoke Article 50 maybe by the end of this month. We see France, we see Germany, Sweden, and it looks like the EU might be doomed at this point. Here in the United States, we see the Fed going to be, like you said, going to be raising interest rates. We also see the debt ceiling. That is also another problem. And if the Fed does raise rates, because we know that Europe and Japan, they're in the negative territory right now. If the Fed does raise rates here in the U.S., what impact will that have on the economy? Will we see anything if they do it once again?
Well, a quarter point change in a short-term interest rate is not a big deal fundamentally, but it can be over time a pretty big deal if you get a lot of small increases like that, and it affects the psychology of the market. And that's the way it usually goes. Normally, at the peak of the business cycle, the Fed is raising interest rates and it doesn't do anything. It raises interest rates again and it doesn't do anything. So they end up raising interest rates fairly dramatically from the cyclical low and find out at the peak that they overdid it. Because remember Economics 101, where they taught us that there's a variable lag between changes in monetary policy and the actual effect on the real economy. And it can be from 6 months to 18 months and maybe longer than that. So the Fed is always flying blind. They don't know whether the last thing they did was enough and the effect is going to hit at some point in the future, or it was insufficient and they need to do more. So over time, they tend to do more. And you get an exaggerated effect then on the financial markets, which turns into a recession. So that's the process that's at work right now. And I wouldn't expect the quarter point rise that everybody thinks is going to happen this week to have much of a fundamental effect on the market. But at some point, it'll have a psychological effect. And at that point, it'll manifest as the bond market doing crazy things with interest rates going up really dramatically, or the stock market tanking, or some other thing. We've got a lot of interest rate derivatives out there. And by a lot, I mean several $100 trillion face value of them. These are contracts in which one hedge fund makes a bet with a big bank, for instance, about which direction interest rates are going to go, which means that if interest rates were to get very volatile, especially if they spike, lots of people are on the wrong end of that bet and have to pay off. They won't be able to pay off. That's the way this usually goes. Some of them will go bankrupt, which means they'll stiff the counterparty on these big derivatives, and maybe some of the counterparties will go bankrupt, and you get a cascade failure of the financial system. That almost happened in 2008, 2009 with credit default swaps, which are a different kind of derivative, but equally dangerous. And if the government hadn't stepped in and bailed out AIG, which was a big insurance company that was a dominant player in that kind of derivative, then Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and Citigroup would be gone now. They would have evaporated. Now, in the intervening decade, we could have, if we'd learned the correct lesson from the Great Recession, scaled back the amount of derivatives that the big banks are responsible for and regulated them in some way that brings them under an umbrella of a regulatory agency that forces the players to maintain adequate capital, et cetera, and we wouldn't have the problem we have now. But instead, we just basically left the derivatives market to its own devices. We didn't re-regulate it, and we allowed the big banks to get even bigger in derivatives. So now the market's bigger than it was. Leverage is more extreme than it was. And the debts in general that are out there are much, much bigger than they were. So we're in a lot worse shape now than we were at the beginning of the Great Recession, which almost blew up the global financial system. And so when you look around, you see potential catalysts. In other words, fuses that are lit now and could blow up the system everywhere. The Italian banking system is functionally dead right now. And their 10-year treasury bond rate just went from a little over 1% to like 2.4%. In the past year and a half, which means the Italian government is paying way more for its continuing borrowing than it used to have to. And that alone is enough, in the absence of the European Central Bank stepping in to bail these guys out, that's enough to blow up the Italian economy, which in turn would threaten the Eurozone and the EU, and by implication, the rest of the global financial system. And that's just Italy. Japan has extraordinary problems, and China is trying hard to stave off a credit bubble because it borrowed so much money in the last 7 or 8 years, and it's not completely succeeding. And the US, which relative to these other guys looks pretty good, is fundamentally a huge mess also. We owe more money than we've ever owed in the past. And just in the past 8 years, under the Obama administration, the government borrowed more than all previous presidents combined. And it looks like Donald Trump, based on his expressed policies, wants to continue with that. He'll increase the amount of debt that Washington is taking on at an accelerating rate, and we'll just dig ourselves further and further into a hole. So all of this is unsustainable, and lots of things could happen in the year or a few years ahead to bring the game to an end. And so it's more a question of when it happens and what's the immediate cause than if it's going to happen. So as individual investors, this presents us with a pretty challenging situation. If we're trying to protect our families and actually make money going forward, then we have to sidestep all these landmines somehow. And that's not easy because you don't know which landmine is going to blow up first and set off the landmine beside it. And so you have to know where to stand ahead of time. And it's a tough one. Historically, when systems over leverage and start to devalue their currencies, which is basically where we are now, everybody's got too much debt that has to roll over, and they need to roll it over in cheaper and cheaper currency in order to be able to pay it off. Historically, that kind of situation has been pretty good for precious metals because gold and silver are a kind of money that has worked in the sense that it's maintained its value for 3,000 years. Through revolutions and empires rising and falling and hyperinflations and wars, et cetera, gold and silver have stayed valuable. So when we start to worry about the management of the currencies that our governments are now running, we tend to scurry back into gold and silver as a place to hide out. And so that capital flowing into what is a pretty small market sends the price in local currency of gold and silver way up. We've seen that. We saw it during the Great Depression when gold and silver went up. We saw it in the 1970s, which is the most recent currency crisis that we've gone through when gold and silver just soared. And we saw it post 2008, 2009 for 4 or 5 years when terrified capital flowed into those markets and sent the prices way up. We're heading back to a time like that again, more than likely, because the response of the governments of the world to the next big crisis will almost certainly be way easier money, way lower interest rates, vastly increased government deficit spending. And that kind of thing is generally good for gold and silver because the money that's created in that way has to go somewhere. And everything else is overvalued right now. So I think that's one thing that's fairly simple that individuals can do. Just buy some gold and silver coins, buy some mining stocks, and in that way you insulate yourself from the worst of the trouble that's coming. There are lots of other things you can do, but those are the simplest that you can do with a phone call or a mouse click today.
You mentioned the debt. Before Trump was campaigning, he said that he didn't agree with the Congress about how they were raising the debt ceiling under Obama. And we know that Obama and Boehner, they made this joint pact to not to revisit the debt ceiling problem until Obama was out of office, and that's where we are today. So do you think at this point, one, will the debt ceiling be raised, or do you think they're not going to raise it right now?
Well, I think the debt ceiling, now remember this law was created to make it hard and embarrassing for governments to borrow more money because they hit this limit, that's the credit limit, for instance, on their credit card. And they have to publicly vote to raise the limit on the amount of debt that they can take on. And that was supposed to be something that moderated their behavior, but it didn't. It became a rubber stamp, except when the president and Congress were ruled by two different parties. Then it's a vehicle for embarrassing the people in charge. But when everybody's, when the same party is in charge of all the branches of government, the idea that the debt ceiling wouldn't be raised automatically is pretty far-fetched, because that would mean the Republicans in Congress were going out of their way to embarrass a sitting Republican president. So I think that's highly unlikely, unless the Republicans in Congress are so sick of President Trump already that they're willing to blow up his presidency in its first few months. That's probably not in their interest. So I wouldn't expect the debt ceiling to be much of an issue. We have lots of other issues out there, though. The European elections are a big deal. And the policies that Trump is trying to enact right now are a really big deal. Immigration and healthcare, things like that are political landmines that could translate into financial instability for the U.S. So I would be paying more attention to actual policy, which is chaotic in its own right, and less attention to something that's a non-issue if they don't want it to be an issue, like the debt ceiling. For instance, right now there's an election being held in the Netherlands that has the potential to stir up trouble in the Eurozone if Geert Wilders, the basically Dutch Donald Trump, wins this election, he's anti-EU, anti-Euro, and that would send a shockwave through the European financial markets, which in turn would spook the rest of the global financial markets. And so that's a fairly big deal because it's psychologically important. And then Marine Le Pen is running for president of France in another few weeks. And if she wins the first round of voting, same thing. The Europe gets spooked, and that possibly spooks the rest of the global financial markets. And that's the kind of stuff that, first of all, you would normally expect in a badly run financial system. When we screw up our finances, politics follows along. And so we're seeing populists either winning elections or running a close second in a lot of different places. And the reason for that is that it's clear to a lot of people that today's financial and economic system is being run for a tiny little group of elites who benefit from it at the expense of everybody else. So when someone stands up on stage and says that, and promises to step in and fix it by moving resources away from the 1% and back to the 99%. They generate a lot of votes. So whether the current European elections end up being the things that spook the markets and catalyze the next big financial crisis or not, the process of political systems being thrown into turmoil by the rise of populist parties is going to go on until the system changes. So politics is going to feed back into finance, which in turn will feed back into politics for years until this system breaks down. So we might end up with a bunch of Donald Trumps and Marine Le Pen's in charge of the major countries of the world, or we might end up with close elections that spook the financial markets and send the system over a cliff. Either way, today's system is going to change in a very big way in the not too distant future. And so again, the question is one of timing and whether the transition is absolutely chaotic and terrifying and debilitating for most people in the world, or whether it's not quite that bad, whether it happens in a way that that doesn't destroy the financial lives of the average person. And I think the first scenario is probably a lot more likely based on history, just because it's hard to make big changes in democracies without a crisis to focus everyone's minds. And so I think that what we will have to see is some kind of a stock market crash or a bond market crash or some kind of big political upheaval that spooks everybody before the countries of the world sit down and hammer out a new monetary system that works going forward. And I think it's going to have to be based on some kind of commodity-related system where the currencies of the world are linked to something like gold and exchangeable one for one into some weight of gold, so that the supply of currencies going forward is under some kind of control. And for governments to give up that kind of power will take an alternative scenario that's even worse from the point of view of the guys running the Fed and the ECB and the Bank of Japan. We aren't there yet, but we could easily be there when the next 2008, 2009 style crisis hits, and we find out that we're in even worse shape than we were back then, and there are, bonds blowing up everywhere, and a debt crisis that is feeding into a stock market crisis, which is feeding into a gigantic political crisis. When they're confronted with something like that, it's possible that they sit down and try to hammer out something that is more sustainable than we have right now. It's also possible that the system just completely spins out of control, and we have a hyperinflation followed by a 1930s-style depression that lasts 10 years and destroys hundreds of millions of lives around the world. And I know how crazy that sounds, but based on the numbers, it has the look of inevitability. So we're really just reaping what we've sown over the past 30 or 40 years with absolutely bonehead monetary and fiscal policies around the world.
You mentioned the nations getting together and hammering out a new type of currency that's going to be gold backed. So I just want to get this straight. Are you saying that the dollar as we know it is going to change? Well,
the dollar is a fiat currency. In other words, something that exists just because the government says it exists and isn't related to anything in the real world. That's unsustainable because in effect, it hands an unlimited credit card to elected officials and their appointed bureaucrats and the big banks by implication, because the Federal Reserve is owned by JP Morgan Chase and Citigroup and Goldman Sachs. So obviously, giving that kind of power to that group of people is going to corrupt them and lead to a system in which debt goes up year after year after year, and a currency crisis becomes absolutely inevitable somewhere out there in the future. We've created exactly what you would expect for us to have at this point after 30 or 40 years of that. So we can't have this going forward without a gigantic crisis. So yeah, the dollar as it's defined today has to turn into something that's defined more clearly and in a way that controls the ability of the world's governments to create new currency at will and borrow money in unlimited quantities. And the only way you can do that is by linking the value of the dollar to something that doesn't change. Now, the supply of gold goes up by about 2% a year because it's hard to get. You got to dig it out of the ground and then process it before it can make it to the market. And historically, the amount of gold we've been able to get that way has grown pretty much in line with the human population, which is why gold has tended to hold its value over long periods of time because its supply is fairly stable. The amount of gold per capita in the world has more or less stayed the same for several thousand years. And because of that, its value has been stable. You can go back to the Roman Empire, for instance, and see that an ounce of gold bought a fairly nice man's toga back then. Well, today, an ounce of gold will buy you a pretty good business suit. Same thing for pretty much anything else you want to look at, wheat, oil, et cetera, et cetera. Gold has held its purchasing power over time, whereas the fiat currencies of the world have plunged in terms of the stuff you can buy with them. So at some point, we have to go back to a system that maintains the value of the currencies that we use. And the only way historically that we've ever found to do that is a gold standard. So yeah, I think that'll be on the table. And it'll be a question of at what point governments are willing to give up the power to create unlimited amounts of currency to pursue their goals and hand that power back to the marketplace. They won't do it willingly, but at some point they'll have to do it. And it probably won't be the same people that are in charge now. There will be a changing of the guard where you get Ron Paul types actually winning elections around the world. And those guys appointing people who believe in a stable currency rather than a fiat currency that is devalued by explicit government policy year after year after year. And they'll just put it in place. But those guys won't get elected. A Ron Paul type politician gets 5% of the vote right now in the U.S. because people haven't been convinced of the need for limited government and a stable currency. We have to have that debate, and we won't have that debate until there's some kind of a crisis. When the crisis hits, then the internet is just going to light up with discussion of what exactly money is and what its role in a society is and how government should function relative to the monetary system. And there will be a lot of different opinions ranging from the far left, who says that money is just a figment of our imagination. It's anything the government should say that it is, and government should be completely in charge of the economy, all the way over to the libertarian, classical liberal side, who would like to go back to the original definition of money as gold and silver in the Constitution, and the enumerated powers of government that it can't go beyond. That's going to be an interesting debate when it happens. And I don't think it's clear which side wins at this point, because authoritarian/totalitarian arguments are very compelling in times of crisis, because you want a strong person to come in and clean things up and stop the bleeding. And that's why after major financial crises throughout history, you see frequently dictators coming to power. Napoleon took over after the French Revolution destroyed the currency at the time. They had a hyperinflation, and then boom, they've got a military dictator. Germany had an epic hyperinflation under the Weimar government in the early 1920s, and then a few years later, Hitler's in charge. That's the kind of thing that is psychologically completely understandable. We want someone to fix what's going on right now to stop the bleeding. And if they have to step on a few toes and maybe ignore the Constitution in the process, let's just let them do it so we can get over this immediate problem. And then we'll deal with them later. Well, it's not easy to deal with somebody like that after the fact once they're in power. And that's a big concern going forward, because this is going to be a financial crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen in our lifetimes, based on the numbers. I mean, we've never been this highly leveraged before. And therefore, if excessive leverage inevitably leads to some kind of a crisis, this crisis should be really big because the leverage is so gargantuan right now. And it could well be that the political crisis that follows the financial crisis is also one for the record books. So yeah, it's a scary prospect. And the sad thing about it is that it could have easily been avoided. We didn't have to borrow this much money year after year after year for 30 or 40 years. We could easily have lived within our means with the wealth that we had at our disposal starting in 1971. Richard Nixon, of course, is going to go down in history as a very bad guy, but less for the stuff that eventually forced him out of office and more for the things he did that aren't necessarily recognized as horrible right now, which is taking the dollar off the gold standard, first of all. If he had decided when the U.S. was seeing outflows of gold because it was spending too much to rein in the government spending and in that way stabilize the demand for dollars versus gold, rather than keep on spending and borrowing huge amounts of money and then just take the dollar off the gold standard and make it a pure fiat currency, which made all the other currencies of the world pure fiat currencies. If he had taken that, the first path, then we probably wouldn't be in the shape that we're in now. We would have had a government that continued to more or less live within its means, and the amount of leverage in the system wouldn't have grown to this point. Banks wouldn't be these monstrosities that dominate the world, and the hedge fund sector wouldn't be multiple trillions of dollars, et cetera, et cetera. Derivatives wouldn't be approaching $1 quadrillion. All of that stuff happened because we had fiat currencies. Take that away, give us a gold-backed currency that is stable in value and that with a supply that grows about 2% a year, and that other stuff wouldn't have been possible. So you can trace our current problems back to 1971 and the increase in debt back to 1980 when the Reagan administration found out that you can borrow as much money as you want to and there's no political price to pay because it doesn't seem to affect the lives of the average person. Well, the government has learned that lesson, and that's how they live now. They borrow as much money as they need to wherever they are. Japan, China, Europe, the U.S., we've all learned that same bad lesson, and we're all acting accordingly. We've all been corrupted by fiat currencies. And there's, as I've repeated a couple of times, there's no doubt that a gigantic crisis flows from all this leverage, and it's just a question of when and how.
John, I have two questions. One, when you mentioned when we go through this financial crisis, the dollar, hopefully will be backed by gold. Will it still be the reserve currency of the world? Two, when we do go back to a gold-backed type of dollar, what happens to the current dollar where people have it in their savings, their pensions? Does that affect it in any way? Does it lose value? What happens at that point?
Well, who knows, really? One scenario is that we, in effect, devalue versus gold. We go back to a gold standard, but with gold at $10,000 an ounce. So the dollar from that point forward is defined as 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold. So the dollar is just a name for that much gold. That would involve a huge burst of inflation in the short run. All of a sudden, that gallon of milk that cost you $2 at 7-Eleven today would cost you $10. And spread that throughout the rest of the economy. But then after that burst of inflation, you would have virtually zero inflation going forward because the dollar would be linked to something that is only growing at 2% a year. And so its value would tend to be stable over time. And that's a mess if you've got a bank account, right? See, the people who are hurt by this are the people who trust the current system. So if you've got most of your money in cash under the mattress or a bank account or some other dollar-denominated asset, government bonds, for instance, that are going to pay you, let's say, 1% a year in interest in dollars going forward, automatically lose 3/4 or 7/8 or whatever of their value on the day that wave of inflation hits. So the victims of that kind of a change are regular people who aren't paying a huge amount of attention and who think the dollar is just going to be what it is going forward. When it changes, they're the ones who are hurt. The guys who make out from it are the ones who own real assets. If you own a Van Gogh and there's this burst of inflation in a very short time, well, the value of that Van Gogh is going to go up in dollar terms. Same thing with the London penthouse, same thing with a solar farm or some other well-chosen piece of energy asset, or a rental property in a fairly stable real estate market, or gold and silver bars. Those things will tend to go up in value because they're stable in terms of supply. There aren't any more of them out there. So if the dollar goes down in value, then the dollar price of those things will go up automatically. And so you'll be fine if you have those things because you're protected by the limited supply of your assets. But if you own dollars or government bonds, which are basically just a proxy for dollars, then you're screwed. So going forward, as we work this through intellectually, the conclusion becomes inescapable that you want to shift your finances from financial assets like bank accounts, dollar cash, and government bonds, and to an extent corporate bonds, and into things that exist in a limited supply and can't be made on a printing press or some other way by governments. And again, this isn't really a unique idea. It happens over and over again throughout history. Whenever a country messes up its currency, farmland holds its value, and oil wells hold their value, and gold and silver hold their value, because that's just how that process works. You see this huge shift in capital out of financial assets and into real assets. So we're approaching one of those times again. And if history just repeats, then you've got a pretty simple way to protect yourself. Because this time, however, is different in a lot of other respects. We owe so much more money than we've ever owed before. Everybody in the world is armed with an unlimited printing press, which has never been the case before, because this is a global financial screw-up, whereas previous ones have been country-by-country affairs, where one country borrows too much money, destroys the value of its currency, has a crisis, and then lops a few zeros off of its paper money, and then just goes back to business as usual. This time is different because those times always occurred on a stage that was basically sound money. Everybody else was using gold and silver or some proxy for gold and silver as their currency. So they weren't overly affected because Brazil had to devalue or South Korea had a financial crisis. The rest of the world got by just fine under those circumstances. But now it's everybody. It's all the big countries at once screwing up in basically the same way. And because of that, it's not clear how good a guide history is to what's coming, because we don't have any safe haven countries really anymore. There's no island of stability out there. And because of that, it's not clear who goes first and whether everybody goes together or whether, one country's changing policy affects those of others. This is going to be a set of dominoes out there that can fall in lots of different ways, and it's not clear how they fall. And it's also not clear what the political impact of it is going to be. Are we going to end up with a one world government? And will it be a dictatorship, or will it be some kind of libertarian utopia? There's no way to know. So for an individual, you almost have to just ignore the political and financial background on which you're operating. Come to the conclusion that real assets are probably going to be the best place to be, and you want to be diversified among several classes of them. And then just don't pay too much attention to this stuff anymore, because you can't control it. You can't control what the U.S. government's going to do. You certainly can't control what the Japanese central bank is going to do, or the European central bank, or European political elections going forward. Well, you can't know or control anything about these processes. So all you can do is tend your own garden. Just try to structure your finances, your family's finances, to the point where they're as close to bulletproof from a gigantic financial crisis as you can make them. And you do that by owning real assets and diversifying geographically, have some stuff overseas in what you hope will be a safe venue, a Swiss bank vault, or Hong Kong or Singapore or someplace like that, if you can do it, or some Costa Rican beachfront property. There are lots of things you can get that might come through a developed world financial crisis in better shape than a lot of developed world assets. So if you got the capital to be able to diversify geographically, that's a good thing to do. Otherwise, hold precious metals in several different places, a little bit in a bank safe deposit box, although those are unsafe for a lot of reasons, a little bit buried in the backyard or hidden somewhere else that you can get to very easily. some gold and silver mining stocks, stuff like that, even though brokerage accounts also aren't automatically safe in a financial crisis. But if you spread it around, some of it will probably survive. Pay off your mortgage. Own your house free and clear so that you've got that. Because a house is not really an investment, even though mainstream financial advisors will tell you it is. The upkeep on a house probably offsets the capital gains that you generate in most markets. But it's also something that has utility. It's a place where you can live, and it's a place where your family can be safe. And if you own it free and clear, then you aren't worrying about whether you can make your mortgage payment because you lost your job this month or because somebody's sick or whatever. You own this asset that is a place where you can hide out. And in the survival community, they call it, instead of bugging out, where you take off and try to get away from trouble, you bug in, where you just kind of hunker down in a place that you own and hope that a lot of the trouble will just kind of wash over you because you own your house free and clear, and you've at least got that. So there are things you can do, and I would advise a lot of people or most people to start looking into things like that and start trying to move their finances in a direction that's less vulnerable to a crisis that involves currencies losing their value, because that's really what we're looking at. Some way, somehow, the dollar and the euro and the yen and the Chinese yuan, among other currencies, have to be devalued aggressively. So make that, without bothering to think about all the rest of these details, just make that this kind of target crisis that you're trying to avoid and deal with. And you'll raise the odds that you come through this okay.
John, thank you very much. Great information. Thank you for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Well, I run dollarclaps.com, which is a website that covers a lot of this stuff, updated daily. And my most recent book is The Money Bubble, which is available also on dollarclaps.com or on Amazon.
John, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.